Andy Olson is a historian who focuses on the Midwest pioneer era. Olson has authored the book Forging the Beeline Railroad, 1848 to 1889, The Rise and the Fall of the Hoosier Partisans and the Cleveland Clique, published in 2017, and published several article series since that, including 4 article series entitled The 1818 St. Mary's Treaties, on which this presentation is based, and 3 article series on the Erie Railroad Implorable Reach to the West, 1851-1890. Several unpublished manuscripts are archived in a research collection at the Ball State University, including Autonomy of the 1818 Treaties of St. Mary's and the New Purchases of Indiana, upon which 1818 St. Mary's article series is based. Olson holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Miami University and a Juris Doctor degree from Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago Kent College of Law. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our special guest, Andy, as he gives this wonderful presentation that he's been so gracious to do. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to see if I can load it again. For whatever reason, I'm not seeing it on my screen. So let me just see if I can get it quickly loaded. I think you may have to shift this over to me. Is that correct?
You are the host, so you should be.
All right. I'm having a problem locating the presentation. One second. Here we go. All right. Now the problem is I have to take me just one more second here. I may have to log back in. Let me see. Okay, here I am. Good. Let me see here. Here we go. Good. There we go. Can everyone see that now?
Yes.
All right. Then let me take just a moment to introduce tonight's topic. I was looking at the 1818 St. Mary's Treaties, which were located, the treaties were actually signed in St. Mary's, Ohio, near the Ann Arbor, in what would be west central Ohio, or the west side central part of Ohio. But I discovered certain anomalies in the treaty that ended up involving both the Brothertowns and the Stockbridges. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to take a moment, take a little bit of time to explain a bit about what led up to these treaties, and then how the Brothertowns and the Stockbridges became involved and kind of enveloped in what was going on with these treaties. So that's what I'm going to be up to tonight. So the first segment of our discussion, or of this presentation, will be about what led up to these treaties and how the Brothertowns and Stockbridges got involved in the first place in something that was so far away from where they were located. So on that basis, let's move forward. And Aaron, if there is a problem as we go forward, by all means, please let me know, and break in and let me know if there's an issue. I might also indicate that if you have questions in the course of the presentation, if you could click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen, either Aaron or Austin will then pull these questions together, and at the end of this presentation, I will field questions that are presented to me by either Aaron or Austin. Okay? So with that being said, let's get into this. By the way, this introductory screen is one of 6 treaties that were signed in St. Mary's, Ohio. This was the last one that was signed. This was with the Miamis, which was the primary reason they wanted to do these treaties, was because most of the land that was involved was under the control of the Miamis, which we'll get into here a bit later. And it's also the only one of the treaties that still exists to actually look at. All right, so in terms of the situation in the United States, right after the Revolutionary War was over, this map shows that under what was called the Articles of Confederation, which was the first governing document for the United States, that was in existence from 1783 until 1788, there was a very weak central government, and it was the intention of these various colonies when they formed the United States that they wanted a weak central government. But what that meant, and what you can see in this map, is that states like Virginia, for example, had a huge swath of territory that they laid claim to. And as you can see, other states from the original colonies had these land claims, ostensible land claims that went all the way to the Mississippi River. So something had to change, and it did change in 1787, which was the last year that the United States was being governed under the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution was about ready to be ratified. So when the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787, it was the last major undertaking under the Articles of Confederation. It set up a methodology and a way in which this large territory that's shown here in black could become various numbers of states. There were certain threshold populations and settlement things that were all tied up in this. And there was also the adoption of a very standardized grid system approach to surveying land, and a process by which pioneers or settlers that were moving into this land could get sure title to their land, which had been an issue, by the way, with Virginia, for example, and continues to be an issue even today in Kentucky, where the way in which land and boundaries of lands are defined is very unusual, where you say, go 20 yards to this tree and then over to this stream and then over here. But with the Northwest Territory, there was an agreement that what would be adopted would be this grid system approach to surveying. And why is all this important in the context of the treaty we're about to talk about? It's because with this type of certainty of land titling and of a process by which territory could become states, it led to a huge surge in the migration of white settlers from the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. So the problem was in this, and now I seem to be frozen here on my screen. Let me see here. Here we go. Okay, the problem with this was that, as many of you would understand, the Northwest Territory was alive with a variety of indigenous tribal nations and groups all over it that were occupying for generations, in many instances, land in the Midwest or in what was this Northwest Territory. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, the US government kind of decided that it was going to deal with these various indigenous nations and peoples as foreign entities or nations, and deal with them and kind of group them together for their own interests into broadly defined tribal nations or groups, some of which either were or were not really truly so, because most of these tribal groups were oftentimes controlled at the local and village level. There were only 2 or 3, such as the Ottawas and Miami, that had broad regional leadership at that time. But the United States grouped them together. And so what we were confronted with then at the beginning of what I would call the Midwest Treaty area, which began right at the beginning of the 19th century, is a need for pioneers to be able to settle in the land, and therefore a way in which the United States could open up that land for settlement. It became obviously a problem for not just the United States, but clearly for the indigenous peoples that were living on this land. So in Indiana in particular, and the reason I'm talking about Indiana mostly tonight, is because the 1818 treaties that were signed focused primarily on acquiring land in the upper 2/3 of the state of Indiana. So if you look here, there were actually principally in Indiana at the beginning of the 19th century, 2 indigenous nations. The primary one were the Miamis, and you can see here notated by the black circles where many of their villages were located. And this, as you can see, many of them were grouped around a river, which was the Wabash River. And that was where they had their villages for many, many generations. The area that you notice with the red stars, which is the Delaware Indians, which I'll talk about, or the Lenape, which I will talk about in a moment, they were clustered around the White River. And as it turns out, the Miamis had used this area around the White River primarily as a hunting ground. So the Delawares, which we'll talk about in just a moment, were not indigenous to Indiana. They were, in fact, the most moved or removed tribal group in the United States. They were moved over 14 times. And in the late 1790s, following the treaty in Greenville, they were moved, or they removed to Indiana along the White River with the acquiescence of the Miamis. The other indigenous group in India, primary indigenous group in Indiana, were the Potawatomi, that were located up along the northern border along the St. Joseph River. They're shown in the black kind of triangle or chevron as well. As you can see, they also had some villages along the Wabash River as well, a little farther south. Now, I'm making mention of the primary groups. Clearly, the Weas were there for a long time as well. They were a group that had at one point been part of the Miamis. The Kickapoo were present to a limited extent in Indiana. They had other presence in what today is Illinois. But this was then what was the situation in Indiana at the beginning of this treaty era. And as I mentioned, the Delawares had come to the White River area in Indiana. Some say as early as 1780. It was really principally in 1790-ish time frame. And this happens to be a map of the White River. The White River is, if you can see my pointer on the screen, the White River is here, and this would be east, comes like so, across and through and down toward Indianapolis is down in this area to the left. So there were an estimated 13 or 14 villages that grew up along the White River from the 1790s until the 1820s. And the reason it's important to make note of this is you'll see here as I get further along in the presentation, there is this one area, number 3 on the map, that's called an unnamed site. So this map was put together in the 1930s. By an individual that had written a book about William Connor, who was a Delaware, had a Delaware mother, who was a trader that was located down near Indianapolis. In fact, his trading post is number 12 on this, or near that location. And in any event, the authors in the 1930s had written a book about the settlement of the Delaware along here, and had tried to find evidence of these various town locations. And many they were able to identify. But for purposes of our discussion tonight, the principal one I will be talking about is what I'm calling this unnamed site, which I believe to have been the area in which the Brothertowns primarily, and to a more limited extent, the Stockbridges settled. And Hocking-Pumska's town, which is number 4 here, is very close to this town of Yorktown, which you see that I'm circling here on the map. Hocking-Pumska's town happens to be on land, or if it existed in that vicinity, on land that ultimately my triple great-grandfather had acquired from the US government once the Delaware removed in 1820. And as you'll see here later in the presentation, there is a connection between my ancestor and a family lore in our family regarding what is on that land, which I'm going to save as a little mystery till the end of the presentation as I get closer here. But it is important to understand this orientation, the setup for the Delaware, because it will involve the Brothertown and the Stockbridge a little bit later. Okay, so need I tell you about where you all came from? In upstate New York is obviously where you and the Stockbridges were located. And it was on Oneida National land, but by the early 1810s, there was increasing white encroachment on the Oneida lands up in this area, because it had been decided that the Erie Canal was going to be built very close to where the Stockbridges and the Brothertowns had been settled up in that area. And as a result of the encroachments, there was quite a bit of concern on the part of at least some of the leadership in both the Stockbridge and the Brothertown that they needed to consider relocating further to the west. And of course, as you would know, I need to not need to spend too much time on this slide, but the Brothertown were really a group of tribal remnants from along the New England shore that had been brought together not just by Samson Occom, but also by his relatives, Joseph Johnson and David Fowler, and also with the guidance of John Dean, who was a Quaker that was connected with the Brothertowns in the early days, and then his son Thomas, after 1801, became very actively involved as a advisor and a missionary to a lesser extent, certainly not in what I would call the classic sense, to the Brothertown. And of course, Deansboro still exists to this day, which is adjacent and part of the Brothertown village up there. Important in terms of this discussion was that Samson Occom began preaching. As we know, he was a Presbyterian minister. He did preach to the Six Nations located up on the Oneida land in the 1760s. And this is important because as a result, Occom developed a relationship with and a regard and respect from the Oneida that were located there, to the extent to which they were invited to move their village, and when they started Brothertowns, to bring it to the Oneida land in upstate New York. But they were really unable to do so because of the Revolutionary War, and several of the Iroquois tribal groups were siding with the British, and so the atmosphere was not one where groups that at that point were siding with the Americans would find it to be a safe environment in which to be. And as you would also likely know, the Brothertowns were adjacent to the Stockbridge, or really it's the other way around, because the Brothertowns had received the invitation before the Stockbridges to move on to the Oneida lands. But subsequently, as you will see here, the Stockbridges received an invitation as well. So, as I'd mentioned before, even though the Brothertowns had really begun in Massachusetts, the Revolutionary War prevented them from being able to migrate up to the Oneida lands. So interestingly enough, they stayed with the Stockbridges in Stockbridge, Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War. So once the war was over, the Brothertown, because they already had an invitation to relocate up to the Oneida lands, began their migration in 1783. And Occom arranged with the Oneida tribal leadership that the Stockbridges as well should be able to make this migration. And they began their migration a year or two after the Brothertown had made theirs. So the Stockbridges, very much like the Brothertown, there were tribal remnants that had been gathered in Stockbridge, Massachusetts by a congregational missionary by the name of John Sargent in 1734. So they had actually, therefore, been in Western Massachusetts for quite some time. But once again, they were feeling very much like later both they and the Brothertown felt about the encroachment of white settlers, that they were feeling a need to move as well. And because OCCOM was able to arrange for the invitation for the Stockbridges, they relocated up to the Oneida lands in 1787 finally. So one of the leaders that emerged following the Revolutionary War was HENDRICK AUPAUMUT. Now this picture, by the way, is either of AUPAUMUT or of what may have been his father, who was known as King Hendrick, who was really on the British side. And he was, again, 20 years or so older than Hendrick AUPAUMUT. But in any event, after the Revolutionary War where AUPAUMUT had and the Stockbridges had sided with the Americans, and because he had participated successfully in leading campaigns with the Americans, after the war, the U.S. government turned to AUPAUMUT to see whether he would be willing to become a U.S. agent for the United States government to the various Western tribes that were then located primarily in Ohio and in Indiana, where there was already a lot of problems arising because after the Northwest Ordinance had been signed and you had this huge inflow of white settlers, there was a lot of agitation and a lot of potential for war. And so the US government wanted to send an individual that would be known to a certain extent by some of the tribal groups that were in the Midwest. And because of his original indigenous connection to the Mohican tribal group, that had already, if not a kin relationship with, a very close relationship with the Lenape or the Delaware, he had immediate credibility with the Lenape and the Delaware and some of the other Midwestern tribal groups. And as a result, AUPAUMUT made several visits to the Midwest and dealt with the various chiefs and sub-chiefs of the various tribal groups primarily in Ohio and Indiana to try to quell their anger and see if war could be avoided. And so that's why you'll notice these various trips that he made, primarily in the early 1790s, were specifically preceding what turned out to be various aggressive actions on the part of the US military that were beaten back. Harmer's first efforts, where he was defeated, followed by St. Clair's, and then ultimately followed by Anthony Wayne's. So that's why AUPAUMUT was involved in those days. And then subsequently, he spent nearly 5 years with the tribal groups in the Midwest, primarily the Delawares and the Shawnees, in the 1808 to 1813 timeframe, when he was really tapped as a person to provide those individuals, those tribal groups, with exposure to domestic arts, whether it would be animal husbandry or grain mills and that type of thing, with the idea being that the government wanted to try to civilize the Indian nations. But for AUPAUMUT, and I think this is what's important here, is that he really had a dual mission. On the one hand, yes, he was representing the US government in these visits to the Western tribal groups. But on the other, it had become very clear that the Brothertowns and the Stockbridges and the Oneidas, for that matter, needed to consider relocating away from the white encroachments that were all around them in upstate New York. And so during the time that he was on these various visits, he developed a strong relationship, particularly with the chiefs of the Delawares and also with the Miamis, because what he was really looking for was the ability to gain an invitation on behalf of the Stockbridges and Brothertowns primarily, but also the Oneidas, to migrate to the White River. And that's really what he had in mind. So now let's return to what was going on. So the United States government needed this land in that area that was going to become the Northwest Territory. And at the time, at the beginning of the 19th century, William Henry Harrison was the territorial governor for what was called the Indiana Territory, which was really much more than Indiana, at least initially. It encompassed primarily Indiana, Illinois, and a bit of Michigan that was under Harrison's involved in the Indiana Territory. But in addition to being the Indiana territorial governor beginning in 1801, by 1803, President Thomas Jefferson also gave him a second title as the Indian Treaty Commissioner, with the task of bringing into the United States as much of the Indian land as he could to open land up for settlement by white pioneers coming into the area. One of the things that it's known, this was not a new fact, but for me it was an important discovery along the way here, was that Jefferson actually had penned a private letter to William Harrison in which he was suggesting that Harrison use a number of different tactics to get land from the Indian groups. And so one of the things that Jefferson was talking about in this quote that's on this slide is a way in which to induce the tribal groups to spend their monies if they were involved in any treaty, small treaty settlements, to spend their money on trade goods through their trading houses so that they would, in essence, run up debt and then be able to satisfy or pay off those debts by providing land to the U.S. government. And I think that the quote here is very eye-opening. I mean, many people have this one particular view of how even-handed President Jefferson was. But on the other hand, I think this quotation here from this letter that he sent to Harrison shows a different side of the way in which Jefferson looked at the issue of needing to acquire land in the Midwest. So this map that I'm showing you here is a bit of a confusing one. And you'll notice this kind of this darker area where I'm circling here in Illinois. The reason that that area is darkened is because that meant that land was involved in more than one treaty. And the reason for that is that sometimes, of course, as we understand, many of the indigenous people certainly did not have the same concept of land ownership as the white folks did. And so they did not have defined boundaries between one area and another. And so in order to assure that the United States government had covered all of its potential issues with various tribal groups, there were, in certain instances, overlaps that were resolved by having tribal groups sign more than one treaty as these treaties arose. And so that's the overlapping areas is where you had more than one treaty involved, but you can see that there was a lot of land that Harrison had brought into under control of the U.S. government in that time period when he was the Indian Commissioner, Treaty Commissioner, between 1803 and 1812, just before the War of 1812. So, in spite of the fact that this was occurring, AUPAUMUT was concerned, in fact, that while the Stockbridges were seen by the Delawares or by the Lenape as kin or close to kin, that was not the same for the Brothertowns. Just it so happened, just among the various tribal remnant groups that came together to form the Brothertowns, there was not immediately identifiable kin relationships between any of the tribal members of the Brothertowns and the Delaware, the Lenape. So in order to make sure that that the Delawares would be as welcome, I'm sorry, that the Brothertown would be as welcome as the Stockbridges to settle on this land along the White River, AUPAUMUT initiated what is called the Miami Declaration. So the Miami Declaration was intended to get the U.S. government's stamp of approval on the kind of what I would call the ownership rights of various groups, tribal indigenous groups or indigenous nations, to certain of this land along the White River. So even though ultimately AUPAUMUT wanted to deal directly with the Lenape to make sure that the Brothertown were given the same rights to consider moving to the White River as the Stockbridges had, before that, he decided he needed to deal with the Miamis, who in fact were the primary landholders who, as you may recall, had provided the Lenape with an invitation to settle along the White River after the Treaty of Greenville in 1794. So because of that, AUPAUMUT and the Miami chiefs, including Little Turtle, came to Thomas Jefferson, and in front of Jefferson, they read and talked about the nature of the relationship between the tribal groups. And as you can see, on December 21st of 1808, the language in the Miami Declaration that was signed indicated that neither they, the said Delawares, the Mohicans, or the Muncies, nor their descendants shall ever alienate the land to any other persons or purposes whatsoever, without the consent of the said Miamis and the chiefs before named. So once that document had been signed, AUPAUMUT felt he confidently could now go to the Lenapes themselves and say, look, we've gotten the approval or the okay of the Miami to see that we are co-equal owners of many of these lands. And so he then went to the Lenape and was seeking this approval for the Brothertowns to also be able to come to the White River. And in July of 1809, so very soon after the Miami Declaration, AUPAUMUT traveled to the White River with several of the Brothertown peacemakers, and they got the approval of the Delaware chiefs. In fact, when they returned, they recounted what the Delaware chiefs had said. You have the same privileges as we have to this land. You may take your own choice wherever you would be suited on undivided land along this river. There you may build your fireplace. So AUPAUMUT had secured this approval for both the Stockbridges and the Brothertowns before the War of 1812. So once the War of 1812 began, William Henry Harrison was involved as a soldier during that war. And even though he had brought a huge number of acres of land under U.S. control, it still left Indiana, as you can see it here in this map, as still having only the lower third of the state of what is today's state of Indiana under their direct control. And in fact, by 1816, by the way, Indiana was organized as a state. They had met these various threshold levels. And in 1817, Jonathan Jennings, who was their first governor, was really putting the pressure on the negotiators and on the Secretary of War that, you know, for want of any further extinguishment of Indian title, Indiana could not have its seat of government where it where it wants to be, which would be ultimately in Indianapolis. And so there was a lot of pressure on the U.S. government to secure additional portions of the state of Indiana. So one of the individuals that happened to be a judge in the U.S. District Court out of Vincennes, Indiana, was a fellow by the name of Benjamin Park. He also had been tapped as a treaty commissioner in 1816, 1817 to work with what was originally thought to be an intent on the part of the Weas and the Miamis and the Delawares to treat for a portion of the White River lands. It turned out in 1816, which is when this smaller treaty occurred, it didn't amount to much. Neither the Miamis nor the Delawares attended, only the Weas attended, and they simply confirmed their existing land locations and authorization to treat with them to bring that land in under the U.S. control. But during that time, toward the end of 1816, when they got together, it became clear from the Weas discussions with Park that the Lenape would be willing to treat for all of the land that would be along the White River that was theirs. And in fact, at that point, as you can see, they had already sent sub-chiefs out to the Missouri Territory to look at land that was adjacent to where one of their sub-tribal groups had migrated in the 1780s after the Gannett-Houghton massacre in Ohio. And so Chief Anderson of the Indiana Lenape was very interested in trying to join his brethren in Missouri if that was possible, because he, like what had been the case with the Brothertown and the Stockbridges, were tired of all of the encroachment of the white settlers onto their land. In fact, he communicated that after the treaties, give a sure title to this land so that the white people may no longer disturb us. So this map in the lower left, if you notice, I've circled in red where ultimately the Lenape did migrate at the end of the treaty of the St. Mary's Treaty of 1818. This was the land that they were looking for. So what's interesting about it is that even though they were the Lenape and Chief Anderson was looking at migrating, still they continued to try to bring and gather the Stockbridge kin to Indiana. And in part, that was because Anderson, Chief Anderson, or KIKTHAWENUND, was very intent on trying to help the Lenape regain the stature that at one point that they had, and to begin to bring together the Lenape all in one location so that they could work toward this singularity of community that they had once had. And so any tribal remnants, such as some of the individuals that were part of the Stockbridge, were encouraged to come and join them. So even on the one hand, while Anderson was negotiating with the U.S. government, on the other hand, as you notice here, in July of 1817, he sends a letter to the Stockbridges, to Sargent, John Sargent, that was there, and who was their missionary, and using it, grandchildren, your grandfathers have at 2 different times given you a seat on the White River. Prepare in haste and come and set down on the ground your grandfathers have given to you. The problem had been, following the War of 1812, that there was obviously a huge gap in time. Can I ask someone does not have their microphone muted? Can I ask someone to mute their microphone? Thank you. So in any event, there had been such a time gap between 1808, when the Miami Declaration was signed, and when the Brothertown had come in 1809. Now it's 1817. You know, it's clear that Anderson was becoming impatient and wanted the Stockbridges to come join them. So, however, the Brothertown situation was different, as I mentioned earlier, because they did not really perceive that they had a kin relationship with any of the leadership within the Lenape tribe. So even though, as you'll notice here in the quote in the upper right-hand corner, in 1809, when they had visited with the Lenape on the White River, they were given the approval to come and migrate. It had been a long time. So as a result, in 1817, a number of Brothertown peacemakers, and you'll see them noted here on the lower left, came with Thomas Dean, their agent and Quaker advisor. They came to the White River area. And what's so interesting about this, and again, I would assume many of you are aware of this, it was an all-water voyage from where they were in upstate New York. And this map, even though it is a map of a French explorer's travels along virtually the same course, it shows how they were able to accomplish this task of getting this group of people from up in Brothertown, New York, all the way to the White River to talk with both Chief Anderson and others there. So it's important to note, and this it was very fortunate, Thomas Dean, shown here on the right side, was a very good journal writer. He kept a journal, a diary that has been retained, and his grandson actually had it put into a book form, and that book became an important key in what I soon would discover. And one of the keys to that was the identification that he made of the Brothertown peacemakers that came along on this voyage. And as you notice, it included Jacob Dick and his wife Sarah in particular, the Isaacs, Thomas Isaac and his wife Betsy, and Rodolphus Fowler. And then at the same time, he recounts that Isaac WOBBY was already located in the Fort Wayne area. And these are all known and ultimately we know to be brother towns that had made this voyage. So interestingly enough, the first stop that they made was in Vincennes, where they talked with the first governor of Indiana, Jonathan Jennings. And as you can see, very quickly, Thomas Dean observed that Jennings was going to be no friend to the Indians. So in 1817 now, by this time, the US government had issued a commission to Lewis Cass, who was the territorial governor of Michigan, but also had a secondary title as also being responsible for all the Indian/indigenous peoples' relationships within the territory well beyond the Michigan territory itself. That he and another individual that had been involved in both the military and in politics in Ohio, Duncan MacArthur, these two were commissioned by
We lost your audio for some reason, Andy. It doesn't appear as though you're muted.
I could still hear him.
It's working on my end.
Okay,
You all
sorry,
right?
maybe that was just me.
All right, can you hear it all right?
I can hear you now. Sorry,
Okay.
everybody.
Okay, so what happened was the the War Department issued this commission for Cass and Duncan MacArthur to treat for the remaining part of Ohio that was not yet within the U.S. control. And that was primarily this yellow area, 87 here, this large area, and then this little notch of land that extended up into Michigan. Those two pieces had not yet come into control of the U.S. government. So that was what the scope of their commission was going to be. But at the same time, after that commission had been issued in 1816, for them to have this scope in the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty, it was only afterwards that they heard that the Delawares, the Lenape, might be interested in treating for the entire part of the land that they were living on in Indiana along the White River. And so what's interesting about it here, and it's important as it relates to the Brothertown and the Stockbridges situation, is that even though the Lenape had very little land left in Ohio at the time, they had 2 or 3 small village groups or village areas, still, Cass decided, and as you notice here in this quote that I've included from August of 1817, he decided to invite the chiefs of the Delawares and the Miamis and the Potawatomis and the Ottawas, because these people would have both controlled much of this land along the White River in Indiana, and they would be able to influence others that had smaller roles in that effort. So what you had in the late fall of 1817 up in Fort Meigs, and Fort Meigs, by the way, is very close to Toledo, just south of Toledo along the Maumee River. So what you had here then was not only the tribal groups that were in control at that point of this large swath of yellow land and this small little notch here, but you had all of these other apparently unrelated to the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty indigenous chiefs there. And so why is that important to the Stockbridge and the Brothertown story? In the next slide you'll see, but suffice it to say it was important because the treaty, the time of the treaty, which was toward the end of September of 1817, coincided with the voyage of the Brothertown peacemakers along with Thomas Dean to Indiana. So in any event, that's an important thought to keep in mind, and I'll explain that in the next slide. But the other important aspect of the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty was, while they were successful in treating with the Indians for these 2 areas that were left in Ohio, part of the way in which they operated is they provided land grants, or in essence, almost like either bribes in some instances or holdbacks of land that the indigenous tribal leaders could retain for their own use or for the use of their tribal groups. And so there were a number of reserves, as they were called, that were put into these treaties. But some of these reserves, what's unusual about them is that they were provided fee simple title to the lands that were in these reserves. And for those of you that aren't lawyers, the important thing about fee simple title is that they were free, they owned the land, and they could sell it to whomever they want at whatever price they want at any time. It's the way in which land is held today by most individuals in the United States. But what happened was, in general, the US government rarely had provided fee simple title to reserves that were given to Indian groups, indigenous peoples in these and any of the other treaties that they had done. So when the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty went to the US Senate for confirmation, it was rejected. And Ohio Senator Morrow, he basically said, look, you're going to have to renegotiate this. And while the reserves themselves are fine, you cannot provide them fee simple title. So you're going to have to treat with them again. And that's in essence what he is saying in this quote below. What he said is that instead of really calling it a rejection, he's just saying we're going to call this a postponement, with the idea being that you will renegotiate this at a later time. So that was the setting at the end of the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty. On the one hand, you had all the Delawares, the Miami, and the Potawatomi chiefs and sub-chiefs present. On the other hand, Cass and MacArthur found they were going to have to renegotiate the treaty. So what happened, however, was Thomas Dean and the Brothertown peacemakers had made their visits both to Vincennes, but that they had then gone over to Andersontown and met with Chief Anderson, and then had worked their way up to Fort Wayne. And Fort Wayne was at the confluence of the Wabash River with the, actually not the confluence, it was the headwaters of the Wabash River, and there was a relatively short portage there to the Maumee River, which with that one portage, you could get all the way from Lake Erie all the way down to the Mississippi River, and that happened to be the area that was controlled by the Miami at that point. And so Isaac WOBBY had located there. And so in this traveling, Dean and the Brothertown peacemakers had come to Fort Wayne to meet with WOBBY. And when they got to Fort Wayne, it was the third week or so of September, his wife, Jane, indicated that Isaac WOBBY had already traveled to the Fort Meigs Treaty because all of the Lenape and Indian and Miami Indian chiefs or sub-chiefs were going to be there. And so Dean and the peacemakers immediately departed to get to the Fort Meigs Treaty to meet with the Delaware. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, the day after the treaty concluded on September 30th, as you note here at the top, Dean in his journal indicated that in the evening of October 1st, they held a council with the Delawares and the Shawnee chiefs, and that the Delawares, in the presence of John Johnston, who was the Indian agent responsible for the Lenape and the Miami tribes at that point, expressed the desire that the Brothertown Indians would go into their country. And on the 2nd of October, Dean received a certificate from Johnston of the purport of that council. So this was the confirmation that Dean and the peacemakers were seeking before they would commence a migration to the White River. And if you notice here with a couple of the little bullet points, that what happened subsequently is the Brothertowns actually preferred land that was deeded by documents that were filed with the state and federal governments instead of just a promise for land. But at that point, Johnston was unwilling, and I think Cass as well, to provide that kind of a guarantee. So they left the session in on October 2nd with the permission to move, that is to relocate, and the promise simply to continue talking about the nature of the land grant that they could receive. More importantly was Isaac WOBBY and his family, and it was not an insignificant number of people that made up his family group, relocated from Fort Wayne because right after the Fort Meigs Treaty, John Johnston, who was living in Piqua, Ohio, which is very close to where St. Mary's, Ohio is located, Johnston had now taken responsibility for both the Lenape and for the Miami. That now fell under his U.S. Indian agent scope of responsibilities, whereas before he had just the Lenape. Now he had both. So WOBBY moved Topeka with his family, to be near to Johnston, because he correctly perceived that while Johnston did not have a specific defined commissioner's role within the treaty structure, he was going to be of paramount importance in persuading and working with the treaty commissioners on behalf of the Brothertown. And certainly Johnston had been the one that was present after the Fort Meigs Treaty when he gave the certificate to Thomas Dean and the peacemakers of their authority to relocate. So as it turns out, Dean and some of the others returned to Brothertown, New York, but several others of the Brothertown remained in the Midwest, including Jacob Dick and Thomas Isaac and their families. So now the problem was, what was the U.S. government going to do about convincing the Lenape and the Miamis and others to renegotiate the Fort Meigs Treaty, and to do so, basically take away the fee simple title for these reserves that they had been given, and make it what I would call the more classic type of reserve in these treaties, which was that in many instances, those receiving these reserves could only remain on the land either for their own lives or the lives of their children or grandchildren, and or any conveyance of land needed the approval of the U.S. government. So therein was the dilemma for Lewis Cass, John Johnston, and MacArthur, who were the commissioners for the 1817 treaty. So as a result of that, Johnston, who was much closer to the ground with both the Lenape and the Miamis, sent a fellow named William Connor, shown here below, and he was an interpreter for some of the earlier treaties. He had been raised by a Delaware mother and a white father. He had the trust and regard of the Lenape. And so Johnston sent William Connor to begin to take the temperature of and convince the Lenape to change the way in which they would be willing to take the land that would be offered to them. At the same time, as you can see, by the end of the year, by the end of December of 1817, Johnston felt confident that he would be able to, through William Connor, to get the Lenape to move. And in large measure, that's because Chief Anderson was ready to go, on the one hand, and on the other, Johnston subsequently arranged to provide them secret lifetime annuities, both to Chief Anderson and to one of his sub-chiefs as well. At the same time, though, the most fundamental problem was with the Miamis in terms of getting their acquiescence to all of this, because the Miamis were led at this time by a chief by the name of PESHEWA, who was known by the French and English name of Richardville, Jean-Baptiste Richardville. And he was, obviously, because he had a French trader father and a Miami mother, he understood the white man's world. And while up until the beginning of the 19th century, such Métis, as they were oftentimes known, which were this mixed Lenape or mixed Miami and white parentage, were never really had much in the way of leadership positions. Given the situation with the aggressive moves from the U.S. government, the Métis type of profile became very important to the various indigenous groups, and Richardville represented one of those, what became a very powerful chief that was able to deal very effectively with the U.S. government. So the issue was how to then get Richardville on board. And if you notice here, Johnston is indicating to Lewis Cass in this particular letter of the various methods you might want to do to try to attract them. And as you can see, as he calls it there, promise him money or land or an annuity personal, which would be a bribe in essence. And he was telling this to Stickney, who was his sub-chief responsible for the, his sub-agent responsible for the Miami located up in Fort Wayne. So that was one thing that was going, that was one approach that was being taken. And it just so happened in July of 1818, Richardville was up in the Detroit area, which was where Lewis Cass had his headquarters for both governor of the Michigan Territory and the secondary role he had for all Indian relations. And it's very clear in the private meeting that Richardville had with Cass that he made all of the financial and other arrangements that would be necessary for there to be a successful participation of the Miamis, an agreement to endorse the Lenape's agreement to let go of the land along the White River. So that was all in lead up to the treaty. So what the decision was made to pick St. Mary's, which is shown here on the map. The Indiana state line is here. Dayton is located down here in terms of reference point. Lake Erie is just off the map to the north. And they chose this because this was well inside of Indian territory and away from the potential influence of white traders or others that could detract from how these negotiations would proceed. So as a result of this, it was decided that the 1817 Fort Meigs Treaty would be the first of 6 treaties to be negotiated or to be completed. And then there would be 5 other treaties that would go in sequence from what the US government considered to be the relatively least important of the tribal arrangements to the most important, which means that the last 2 treaties that would be finally negotiated would be with the Lenape and with the Miami. So here's the setting as Benjamin Park, who you may remember from earlier had been a treaty commissioner in 1816 for a treaty that was considered over near Terre Haute, Indiana. He was one of the treaty commissioners now at the St. Mary's Treaty, and nearly 5,000 indigenous tribal chiefs and sub-chiefs were assembled across this wide swath of tribal groups, some of which had relatively little land that they were involved with, but there was a desire and a need, and it was a conscious effort to bring together all of these individuals so that they could move this forward as a whole. So it was a very large gathering, as reported by Park. However, now, the issue was, what about the Stockbridge and the Brothertowns? So it was a known issue. I mean, here's John Johnston sending a letter to Lewis Cass in December of 1817. And he's saying there's near 1,000 Indians in New York, in part civilized, who will certainly immigrate to White River in a year or two, if not prevented by a treaty. And once located there, will be a very difficult manner to purchase this country. And then Senecas and Shawnees were also planning to move there as well. So Johnson and Cass knew they were going to have an issue here because Johnston had witnessed and given approval in Fort Meigs to the Brothertown in particular, that they could migrate. So nonetheless, given these assurances, in August of 1818, nearly a quarter of the Stockbridges, or about 75 people, and Brothertowns left for White River. And I can get into it in more detail, but they had sold some, not all, but portions of their properties to fund the migration. So they left in mid-August on their way. Of course, what they find out in the middle of their migration is that the Delaware, the Lenape, and the Miami had treated away the land that was being promised to them. In fact, Isaac WOBBY, who was at the treaty the entire time, as you notice here at the bottom, said, "I have been at this place during the Indian Treaty, which is now about to be brought to a close. The Delawares have sold their land without any reserve for us or them or others. I have said much on the subject, but to no effect." So that was the situation at the end of the treaty. So here's what the treaty looked like. By the way, I'll do a little break here. I've got probably another 10 or 15 minutes. Aaron, do you want us to take a break, or do you want me to just continue?
I think we could just keep going.
Okay. All right. Then I will. So here was the outcome of the treaty. The purple area, which I'm showing with my pointer here, this entire swath was, and a little over into Ohio, was brought in on the treaty with the Delawares and the Miamis, over 7 million acres of land. This area, this is 98, this orange area, over to the left center of Indiana, that was a Potawatomi land, and that was nearly 900,000 acres of land. So the first treaty, the one that's shown here on September 17th, was the renegotiation of the 1817 Fort MEIGS Treaty. And you can see the tribal groups that were involved here. That was over 4 million acres. So the Wyandots had some land up near Detroit, and this was a minor little technical swap of some land up in Michigan for other land up in Michigan. The Potawatomis, as we're showing here, as I showed here, this was nearly a 900,000 acre conveyance. But the biggest part of this by far was the Delaware, and then the Miami acknowledgement of approval of this, of the 7 million acres involved. But at the end of the day, at the various 6 treaties in 1818, more than 12.5 million acres of land shifted into U.S. government control. And of course, what of the Brothertown and Stockbridges that had migrated? As you can see with the quote at the bottom from a paper that I've written on this, a more extensive paper, the Stockbridge and Brothertown delegations stopped for the winter at a Shawnee reservation in Ohio, of which there were a couple, not too far from Wapakoneta. In 1819, there was a report that there was a number of Stockbridges that were first at Piqua and then at Shawneetown in Ohio, before some of them then finished their migration back to upstate New York. So here is where I had this aha moment in my research. In the treaty with the Delawares, okay, so there were 6 separate treaties, but in the treaty with the Delawares, one of the articles talked about the land that was being given as land grants under the treaty with the Delawares. Now, the Delawares, as it turns out, I knew from my earlier research, had no interest in having reserves themselves. Anderson was most interested in the Lenape joining their brethren west of the Mississippi in Missouri. So what was this then when you see that these people that were named, all of whom were Delaware, it said in the treaty language, were granted land? Well, fortunately, because Thomas Dean kept his journal of his voyage to Indiana, I knew who were Brothertowns. And I knew Jacob Dick was a Brothertown. I knew Isaac WOBBY was a Brothertown. I found out through subsequent research that Solomon Tyndall and Benoni Tyndall were both Brothertowns as well. And I also found out that Elizabeth Pachaka was originally part of the Munseys that were with the Brotherton Reservation in New Jersey. And Elizabeth's father had been the chief of the New Jersey Munsees that ultimately migrated to New Stockbridge in 1802, and Elizabeth's brother, Jacob, became the subsequent chief of that Munsee group that were clearly also kin of the Lenape. In any event, I found that out. Therefore, none of the land grantees, with the possible exception of Samuel Cassman, which I could talk about at great length subsequently, but with the possible exception of Samuel Cassman, were all either Brothertown or Stockbridges. And in my research, I happened upon a letter that Johnston was writing to an individual that was compiling a kind of an encyclopedia of Indian affairs by the name of Howe, Henry Howe, in the 1840s. And in this, he had made profiles of a number of the indigenous people that Johnston had come across, and he profiled WOBBY in a very short profile that was subsequently not printed. That is, the editor of the larger treatise, this guy Henry Howe, decided not to include this, but I found this letter, and I thought it was very important because you could begin to see, if you kind of extrapolate from what Johnston has to say about WOBBY, about why or how these brother towns received land. And it basically says, in the Treaty of St. Mary's, Ohio in 1818, I had a half section, 320 acres, assigned to WOBBY. Some years later, he died in Shelby County, Ohio. And then further noting, and this was, as we know, WOBBY was making strong efforts to connect well with Johnston. He often preached for the neighborhood at the schoolhouse on Johnston's farm near Piqua, and led devotions of the family. So we know that the land grants were not misidentified to be given to people that were Delaware. We know that they weren't Delaware. They were, in fact, Brothertown, and one instance, Stockbridge, and the other one, Samuel Cassman, we're not sure about. So, how do we know this, or how did I find this out? So there was a fellow by the name of Isaac McCoy that was a Baptist missionary that was spending a lot of time in Indiana about this time. And he was traveling in 1818 through the area from near Indianapolis up toward Fort Wayne, and he stayed at the house of Betsy Pachaker. And of course, you know, Pachaker is not spelled exactly the same or pronounced exactly the same as Pachaka, but you know, everything was done phonetically in those days. And it is clear to me, particularly the way in which Isaac McCoy described Betsy Pachaka, that she was the same individual. She was a widow with several children, and she had united with the Baptist Church in the state of New York. So clearly, she was a follower, and as you would know, I don't want to get into it in this presentation, but within the Brothertown, there were certain new religious groups that had begun. One that Isaac WOBBY was very involved with, that were a Baptist segment, and Pachaka clearly was part of that group. So we knew from this that Betsy Pachaka, or Elizabeth Pachaka, was a Brothertown or a Stockbridge. And then, as you notice here, I was able to find out that she was the daughter of Jacob, the former chief of the New Jersey Delawares, of the Munsees, who moved to New Stockbridge in 1802, and her brother Isaac had succeeded Jacob as the chief. So Jacob Dick, we know that he was among the chiefs and leading men of the Brothertown tribe from Thomas Dean's journal. And as we would also know from that map that I had, many slides ago, he held several lots in Brothertown, but settled in the Fort Harrison area, which is in Terre Haute on the western center part of Indiana after the voyage. Solomon Benoni Tyndall, I have not found any records within the Brothertown that they were tribal members, but they were characterized as Brothertown people by Thomas Isaac, one of the peacemakers that had gone on the voyage, in a letter that he had written to Thomas Dean. So from that, I make the connection that the Tyndalls were both Brothertowns. And as it turns out, Benoni passes away in the 1820s, and by the time in 1828 that Solomon conveys land that he'd received under this treaty, it was noted that he was the heir of Benoni as well, who was deceased. Isaac WOBBY, obviously we know from many different directions that he was as John Johnston said, a full-blooded Indian of Brothertown, New York, educated in the Eastern seminaries and qualified to preach the gospel. And we've subsequently found out in some conversations that I've had with the historians at the Brothertown, among the Brothertown Nation and others, that he was the son of Roger and Mary, who were, formerly Roger was of the Pequot tribe and was among the founders of Brothertown. He married Jane Pachawker, and boy, there's a piece of me that wonders whether Jane Pachawker is related to Betsy Picharker. I haven't found that out, but I'd sure be interested to know about that if any of you know this. But he was also a Baptist exhorter, which means he was a lay minister that oftentimes would preach the gospel when he was in Brothertown before he subsequently migrated to Fort Wayne. And that leaves only Samuel Cassman as someone that I have not yet been able to confirm the heritage of. He was described by his son as one of the York Indians, which suggests to me that York Indians would be the New York Indians. And turns out the reason he's important in this story is he's the only individual that was able to perfect his claim to the land. All right, so back to the Stockbridges. The Stockbridges received no grants whatsoever. Only the Brothertown did, with the possible exception of Samuel Cassman and or Betsy Pachawker, that we know was, in fact, part of the Stockbridge group. So what happened, though, was John Johnston was, because of the role that he had as the Indian agent for both the Brothertown and Stockbridges, oftentimes letters that would come from the Stockbridges or from the Brothertown or from, Sergeant at the missionary with the Stockbridges or Thomas Dean for the Brothertown would be intercepted by Johnston, who would then consider whether he wanted to deliver the messages to Chief Anderson. And in this particular instance, there were several letters that came from the Stockbridge and Brothertown to Chief Anderson saying, don't sell any more land, hold the land. And Johnston did not convey those letters to Anderson. And in fact, the characterizations that were made here at the top above this document here, that the Stockbridges sent no one requesting a 20 square mile reservation, those were characterizations made by John Johnston. I've seen no other indication within the Stockbridges documentation that they made that request. But in the subsequent congressional inquiry that was made in 1820, Johnston was in essence deposed, and he said, oh yes, the Stockbridges decided they didn't need to come. All they wanted was a 20 square mile reservation, which is what I was supposed to try to find for them. And he also, Johnston, characterized that when the Stockbridges then petitioned directly to Chief Anderson in the Delaware to endorse what you had told us at the treaty in 1817, he refused this reservation, this 20 square mile reservation, because he said that Johnston said that that Anderson wanted the Stockbridges, and particularly the Mohicans that were part of the Stockbridges, to accompany the Delaware west of the Mississippi River. In any event, the Stockbridges did appear before Congress. And what's interesting in this little segment that I cut out of the some of the transcriptions of the petitions that they made and the report that was generated was not only what it was to say, which is, hey, we have the rights to this land, we need to be made whole by this, but also the identification not only of those that were there in Washington, D.C., but if you notice on the bottom part of this, it said it was signed in behalf of our tribe and those of our friends who are at or about White River. So if we can take this as fact, although I've not seen any confirming information that all of these individuals and their families were along White River, we knew then, we would know that there were a significant number of Stockbridges, as well as we know at least a handful of Brothertowns that remained in Indiana or that continued their migration to the White River following that 1818 St. Mary's Treaties. So, what was the fate of these treaty grantees? So this map that you're seeing here is a map of a little town called Yorktown, Indiana. And Yorktown, Indiana is just outside of Muncie, Indiana, about 4 or 5 miles, it would be southwest of Muncie. And so the treaty grants were along, here's the White River that comes by here where my pointer is. And these are the granted areas that were given. So there was a multiple step process that, that you had to go through to perfect your title to this land. So Isaac WOBBY made application for a deed, which was entered into the government books on December 17th of 1820, but it was entered in on behalf of his heirs because either he was ill or he had deceased by that point in time. So his wife subsequently attempted to take title to the land, and that title was rejected because, interestingly enough, it was Lewis Cass who sent a letter to the government about this. She was not really the heir. She only had dowry rights to the land, but not an heir to the land. The fellow that was known as the founder of Muncie, which was a rather interesting title, and there's a whole story behind this fellow Goldsmith Gilbert's relationship with the Indians. But suffice it to say that after a group of what appear to be Miami tribal members burned his liquor/trading store to the ground on the north side of Delaware County, Indiana, today's Delaware County, Indiana, he made it his mission to purchase by hook or by crook all treaty lands in Delaware County. So you'll see the name of Goldsmith Gilbert frequently in this particular slide, because he took some of the settlement that he got, which was some of the tribal monies from earlier treaties, were directed to Goldsmith Gilbert as part of a claim for the burning of his trade store. And he used that money to purchase many of the parcels of land that were part of the Brothertown grants. So he claimed he had clear title to the WOBBY land by 1829 when he turned around and sold it. But in fact, the title to that land was not finally resolved until 1900. Jacob Dick, we know, was dead by 1819. He had sought a title or a patent to the land in 1824 through his heirs, but there was a question about the legitimacy of one of his heirs. And ultimately, Thomas Dick, who was living back in Brothertown, New York, sold the parcel, or I wouldn't say the parcel, sold the right to the grant to Goldsmith Gilbert in 1828. And as we talked before, the Tyndalls, Benoni Tyndall had passed away in the 1820s. Solomon sought to have a patent issued. And in fact, that's the first title of the land, which was issued in 1824. That's why you see them on this map here. And Solomon was living in Wayne County, Indiana, which is the county that is where Richmond, Indiana is located today. In 1828, when he sold the land to Goldsmith Gilbert, or in this instance, he sold the patent, the first title or deed to the land, to Goldsmith Gilbert in 1828, and then migrated to Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is where the Brothertowns were gathering by that time. Elizabeth Pachaker, as you know, she was the one that was likely part of the Stockbridges side of the equation. She made an initial claim for the land, and they came back and said, "Oh, sorry, that land has already been claimed by the WOBBY family and heirs." And so her application was rejected for the land. On the other hand, by 1830, she had now migrated to Kaskaskia, Illinois, would be in Western Illinois, with the Munseys, of which there were a number of Munseys that were living in that area. She petitioned President Andrew Jackson to have that title resolved and land granted to her. And President Jackson refused until they were able to actually locate the parcel of land, and then that she would have to be seen to be able to care for the land before she would be granted title. By now, she's in Kaskaskia, Illinois, and the bottom line is she sold whatever interest she had left in that land to a trader that was located in the Missouri Territory, near to where she was living at the time, in October of 1831. And finally, Samuel Cassman, he was the only individual that actually received the patent to the land and then cleared the land and lived on the land. Even though he sold it, he thought, in 1830 to Goldsmith Gilbert for $500. His heirs objected to the valuation on it. It took 6 years before it was finally adjudicated, and he finally received $1,700 for that land. Interestingly enough, and this is where kind of my personal story comes into this, what happened was Oliver Smith, this fellow up on the left, who was both a politician, he ran a railroad in the 1840s and 50s, and he was a big land speculator. He had represented Cassman in this valuation question in the 1830s. And David Kilgore represented Goldsmith Gilbert. Kilgore happens to be my 3 times great-grandfather. And so what ended up happening in this, by 1837, they had paid the additional amount, Goldsmith Gilbert paid the additional amount, and the land was then sold by Goldsmith Gilbert to Oliver Smith, the land developer, who took ownership of the land and established the town of Yorktown. And it's pretty clear that he did that. He named it Yorktown after the New York tribal groups that were residing in the area, which would be the Brothertown and the Stockbridge. And, you know, you have to understand, why would they have been known as the New York Indians? It's because the white people didn't understand the heritage of the tribal groups that they were dealing with. To them, they were only from New York. And so it makes sense, if you think of it in those terms, that the white man would have called them the York Indians, and thus the name of the town of Yorktown. So the other thing that's most interesting about my ancestors' connection to the Brothertown and or to the Stockbridge is that Kilgore was a lawyer who actually took possession of land in, as you may remember in the map that I showed a long time ago, Hocking-Pomsca's town, which was located very close to that unnamed site. And in the Hocking-Pomsca's town area, in the land that he was receiving from the government, there happens to be an Indian burial ground, a bluff. right there, which is what this is a picture of that I took several years ago when I was on this property. It remained in our family until 2002 when it was finally sold. But this bluff, there was a family lore about this, that my ancestor had made a pledge to the Indians that were then departing the area that neither he nor his relatives would disturb the Indian burial ground located on this property. And in fact, I have in my research, I did find a letter in the 1930s, dated the 1930s, in which an archaeologist from the University of Chicago had been engaged by Delaware County, Indiana, to look at various potential burial sites. And he confirmed, in fact, that there was a burial ground in this area, on this bluff, adjacent to the White River. My ancestor's property is along the White River for a mile. And in fact, in 1926, there was a shirt-tail relative of mine who was traveling throughout the Midwest interviewing various family members. And one of the people that he interviewed would have been my great uncle named Obed Kilgore in 1926. And here's what he said about the pact. There was an Indian graveyard on my grandfather's farm of the York tribe, and Yorktown was named for them. They continued to bury there after David Kilgore owned the farm. He would never let anyone dig in the graves. So I have, in the context of my research, gone back out to that land with the permission of the property owners now, and have looked for evidence of this burial ground without success to this point. But my hope is at some point we will rediscover and be able to confirm the existence, not just of the burial ground, but of the individuals that are buried there. But certainly this interview with my great uncle, whose grandfather was David Kilgore, that there is some credence in what he had to say about this legend and those that are buried on this bluff. So what about the fate of the Brothertown children and the migrants? So what's interesting here is Isaac McCoy, who I had mentioned earlier, was this Baptist missionary and preacher. He set up a Baptist missionary and mission school in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1820, and counted, and we know this from letters that he sent, among the 48 students, he counted at least 8 Stockbridge and or Brothertown children among them. And again, he was trying to do what a lot of the white folk had attempted to do, was to civilize the Indians. And what's great to know is through his letters, the children all migrated with him when his mission moved from Fort Wayne to Niles, Michigan, and he established the Cary Mission there in 1822. And we know, because I saw this as well, in 1826 at the Paradise Springs Treaty in Wabash, Indiana with the Potawatomis, McCoy arranged for each of the students to receive a quarter section of land that would, he envisioned, be used, ultimately sold, to provide funding for the removal of those children to either Wisconsin or to west of the Mississippi. And the reason that we know that these, in fact, were Brothertowns is that you notice in the letter that he sent to Thomas Dean in 1822, McCoy identifies by name the individuals that are students within his mission that were children of Brothertown. And you can see them there yourself on this slide. And at the same time, we know approximately when whatever migrants were left on the White River decided to relocate to Wisconsin, because John Metoxen was through Fort Wayne on the way to Green Bay by 1822, when he characterized to McCoy that he was satisfied with the situation for the children. In a funny footnote, or not so funny really, but an ironic footnote, even though he had been able to secure in 1826 this land for the Brothertown children, he felt compelled to sell the land because of the financial problems that the missions were encountering. So the ultimate disposition of the land and of the children that were part of this, that were living in Niles, Michigan at the time, I have not had the opportunity to further investigate. But so how do we look at these treaties? It's ironic that the quotations that we have are from the treaty commissioners whose goal it was to disenfranchise the tribal groups that were involved. And so it's a little bit skeptical. I'm a little skeptical to have these in the slides, but on the other hand, it shows that there was at least some recognition of what they were really about. Lewis Cass, after the Fort Meigs Treaty, said, "From this day they cease to be hunters and must depend upon their own industry and the produce of their reservations for support. However advantageous speculative men may believe this to be, still, we must not view this as an abstract question, but one intimately connected to their habits and feelings for life. The Indians in this quarter have made the last struggle to preserve the inheritance of manners or of land transmitted to them by their ancestors." And then Benjamin Park, after the St. Mary's Treaties, says, "The object of civilizing the Indians is a pretty theme for the speculative philanthropists, but sounder conclusions may be drawn from a little personal observation than the theory of closet disclaimers." So that, my friends, is the story of the Brothertowns and Stockbridges saga. I'm sorry I've gone long. I hope you have found this worthwhile. And please let me know if there are questions I can answer.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Looks like there's a few questions, so let me pull up the first one here in just a second. All right, it looks like the first question is, love the Hendrick.
Hendrick AUPAUMUT.
Thank you very much. Like this sketch. Never saw before. Where is that from? Where is that sketch from was the first question.
You know, I would have to go back into my records to see, and I'm not sure that it is him. As I say, it could also be what is sometimes thought to be his father, King Hendrick. And the reason that I think it may be his father and not him is, you notice the picture has a scar below his one cheek. And I have seen other representations of King Hendrick that show a similar scar. So I'm not sure that this really would be. And we're not 100% positive that King Hendrick was AUPAUMUT's father, but we know that King Hendrick had visited New Stockbridge at about the time that, and shortly after Hendrick AUPAUMUT had been born. So I'm not sure of whether that's an accurate representation of him or of what could be his father or King Hendrick.
All right, well, thank you. Here's another question. How did Six Nations' response to settler land pressures in New York compare to the Brothertown Stockbridge response? I'm wondering how unique the Brothertown strategy of preemptive migration as opposed to forced removal was among northeastern tribes at this time.
Well, what was interesting, again, it would warrant further discussion, and I have written two different things that would allow you to have a much deeper look at this. The one is a series of 4 articles that were published on the 1818 St. Mary's Treaties in the Indiana Historical Society Press magazine. I have provided links to Aaron, and I think to Austin, to you as well, and to Megan. And I think, Megan, aren't you posting this article series on your website?
It's already there, yes.
So Megan, you may want to tell the folks here how they may want to access this, because this will have more detailed information about your question, but then I'll answer it in just a moment after Megan tells you how to access these articles.
If you go to brothertowncitizen.com and then click the link there for the Digital Historical Library and look on down a ways, it's below the Brothertown migration listing. If you keep going down, you'll see Andy's name there in the St. Mary's Treaties.
And that's a series of 4 fairly long articles that cover what I've covered here in this presentation in more detail. But to your question, there was an unusual circumstance in upstate New York as it related to the land that the Oneidas were living on. And the Oneidas obviously were part of the Six Nations, Iroquois. And that is that in general, the US government was the sole entity that could negotiate with and purchase Indian tribal lands through treaties and whatnot. But there was an exception in upstate New York that dated back to before the American Revolution, in which a Dutch land company, of all things, had gained the right to work directly with, or to negotiate directly with the tribal groups. And in fact, before the revolution, the Revolutionary War, they had received permission of the British government to basically have right of first refusal to over 4.5 million acres of land in upstate New York. So this was before the Erie Canal was, obviously well before that. But the Dutch land company had this right to deal directly with tribal groups, unlike any other situation. In fact, the Dutch land company ultimately sold their rights to this 4.5 million acres, this right of first refusal, to the individual that happened to be the congressman that represented that part of New York. And he's referenced in the articles that I wrote, and also in I have another longer, earlier manuscript that I wrote about this. Right now, his name is escaping me. It's David Ogden. David Ogden he happened to have the Ogden Land Company in upstate New York, and then he became the congressman from that area. So by the time of these treaties, and just before this, David Ogden was both, on the one hand, congressman from that part of New York, and on the other hand, a land speculator that had the right of first refusal on 4.5 million acres of land up in upstate New York. And you'll see in some of the letters that Cass wrote back and forth, one of the things that he did was he wrote a letter to Ogden in upstate New York, and they said, hey, get the Oneida representatives down here for the Fort Meigs Treaty in 1817, and then make sure they're there for the 1818 treaties. We assume this would be to your pecuniary benefit if you got them down here. So the point is that Cass was trying to get the Oneida to participate, particularly in the 1817 treaty, along with the Brothertown and the Stockbridges, because in large measure, HENDRICK AUPAUMUT had said that he was representing the Oneida in what he was trying to do to find land for them to be able to settle on. So I don't know beyond the Oneida, who had some interest in relocating, although the reason they did not attend the 1817 treaty, nor did they attend the 1818 treaties, but I can't decide why. I don't think it related to their lack of interest. I think that there were some blocked communications. That is, Ogden never responded to Cass, and I'm not sure, for whatever reason, that the Oneida were ever informed about what was going on. But what is least clear as it related to the Oneida, it's not true about the others that were part of the Six Nations, that the Oneida and the Brothertowns felt that they were being represented by AUPAUMUT through all of the various interactions he had had with the Western tribal groups. I'll leave it at that.
Great. And then I have one last question for you. Regarding the burial ground, have you ever talked with Bryce Obermeyer?
Yes, I have talked with Bryce. In fact, I've been with Bryce Obermeyer. Yes.
Okay, this individual is just discussing who that person is and their efforts. So you've already spoken with them. And that looks like that's the last question. There's a flurry of comments here or there. But yeah, there's a few questions that we read through in regards to your presentation.
Good, good. I would just say too, just in relation to Bryce and what's been going on here, because my family no longer owns that land and it was sold, and it's now been sold and resold a couple of times, it's been difficult to get access to it and unobstructed access. The problem is, as you can notice from that picture that I took of the bluff, it's been overgrown. In this 1930 letter from the archaeologist at the University of Chicago, which I do have a copy of, describes where it's located, so I knew I could figure out where to go to look for it, but I saw no evidence of it. Although the 1930 letter provides some indication that these would have been, that there was soil that had been moved from below the bluff down right along the river. It was different than the soil that otherwise was on the bluff that may have indicated that the presence, that was part of the reason that it was decided this was a burial ground. But in those days, in 1930, he did some digging and was able to actually find some articles that were part of this. And of course, my mother, who did not grow up on this land, but grew up nearby in Anderson, my mother's father and mother owned this land. And so as a kid, they would find arrowheads and other things on that property. So one of the things that I also had done is I worked closely with, or I've had several discussions with several archaeologists over at Ball State University, which is adjacent to Yorktown. Ball State is in Muncie. And in fact, one of those individuals, anthropologists, has a ground penetrating radar device that we could use on that property if we could get proper authorizations to go over and explore that land, because we would like to, these days there are all kinds of regulations about this. You cannot dig into the graves, as I'm sure you would all be aware, but you can find evidence of those graves with ground penetrating radar and that type of thing. We've just been unable to get the approvals because there's just been another recent sale of this land again. And a problem is most people are very reluctant to have this kind of investigation going on, because if in fact we find evidence of this, it could have an impact on both the valuation and the way in which they could develop that property.
Looking at the time here, and it's a little after 8:30. Is there any last remarks? I just want to say on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. We're all appreciative and fortunate to have you be part of our day.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very excited that I was able to present this to a group, a nation of indigenous people that are directly tied to many of the things that I found out about this. I hope that some of the information that I've been able to put together was new information for your nation that may help you to better preserve your heritage in Indiana that you may or may not have really been aware of.
Mr. Olson?
Yes.
My name is Jessica Ryan, and I want to echo the words that Austin had shared with you. Very grateful for the research that you've done and for your willingness to share what you've learned with us. I am another member of the Tribal Council, and so I extend appreciation to you. I was intrigued by the entirety of your presentation, but in particular, I missed the date on the slide with regard to the congressional documents that you had. Was that February 24th?
There were. It's interesting that you mentioned February 24th. It was actually. Let me go back to that slide. 1 second here. There were. It was February 24th. Yes, I actually have seen a second document that was like February 20th, and I'm not sure why there were two different documents. I think it's because there may have been one report from the committee that was kind of preliminary, and then the final report. That's the only way I can figure out why they would have had two different dates for this. But and I actually have the full document. This is just I've sliced and diced a couple pieces together here, with the hope that being, you know, by the way, Caroline Andler was a person that I interacted with at the Brothertown Nation. I think she was your historian back in 10, 12 years ago. So she is one that I also worked, you know, closely with to get some of the background pedigree information of some of the individuals that received land, the Brothertowns that received land. And I had asked her at the time, and hopefully someone else will pick this up from your nation, to see if we can find any indication of other tribal members, either among the Stockbridges or among the Brothertowns, that were actually present on the White River. I mean, I don't know how much we can believe what was said here, because obviously it would have been in the Stockbridges' best interest to make a representation that there were a substantial number of families that had moved there, in terms of what they would be petitioning for the valuation and financial remuneration. And in fact, I have not done a close evaluation of any of these surnames in the Delaware County area. I'm certainly familiar with is it Knokpot, Knokop name? Because, because one of the children in Isaac McCoy's mission was one of that family. So, I mean, there are some that I'm aware of. I also, as I say, I have not been able to find the ultimate destiny of the children that were Brothertowns and or Stockbridges that were part of McCoy's mission after he moved to Niles, Michigan.
So we have at least one Stockbridge member on the presentation today, and so I know that he'll be a good resource for you. But I have this document, which is also dated that February 24th of 1820, and it's the House report that's a companion, as it appears anyway, to the document that you have shared. If you don't have that in your file, I'll be glad to make a.
I'm sorry?
Okay, we're good now. I'll send you a copy.
That would be great.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Are there any final questions or thoughts before we adjourn our event? It looked like 8:20 we're going to do community, so I just want to make sure everybody's had an opportunity to ask Andy any questions. And again, thank you so much.
You're welcome, and thank you for including me. It was an honor to be part of your group.